who is the Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank. Dr. Fregene, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Correct? Is that your name, Nancy?
Yes, that's my name, Doctor. It hasn't changed. Welcome. It's been a while. The last time we did speak, you spoke at the last African Economic Congress, I think in 2020, when you were on the agricultural section. So I remember. So it's been a while. So thank you for joining us this morning. Let's go ahead because we have quite a lot to chew. I want to understand how amplified Africa's looming food crisis is. How amplified is this looming food crisis?
Okay, so Nancy, the best description I've heard of the looming food crisis is from the BBC, and they were quoting the president of the World Bank. He called it a human catastrophe in the making. And when you think of the real situation, you recognize that on one hand, Africa has lost about 30 million tons of grain that was traditionally coming from Russia and Ukraine, right? On the other hand, we have also lost about 2 million tons of fertilizer that also was coming from Belarus and Russia. That fertilizer, if you were to use it to produce crops, it translates roughly to about some 10 million tons, depending on the kind of crop you're producing. If you're producing mostly cereals, So if you are to add the lower local production and the missing supply of cereals, wheat and maize mostly, from Russia, you're looking at a shortfall of anything between 40 and 50 million tons of food on the continent. That is already more than a third of what Africa consumes, in cereals, every year. So then when you consider the fact that Africa has already been buffeted by high prices of gasoline and diesel, and also high prices of gas, energy costs are already rising. And you also think that there was COVID-19 that disrupted, global supply chains, both of agro inputs and of food. It's a perfect storm. You have, on one hand, lower food production, you have economic difficulties, people are already struggling. You will end up in a situation where many people will not be able to afford food. And God forbid, that always leads, a hungry man is an angry man. That always leads to all kind of crises. It leads to political, uprising that happened in 2008 in Tunisia, when we had a similar food price crisis also then. So it is a real problem, it's a serious problem. And our African Development Bank president, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, has been going around saying Africa is better prepared this time around. Even though we have a crisis, we're better prepared. And African Development Bank is actually leading that effort to ensure that Africa can feed itself, can close that supply gap, and also, kind of win itself from cheap grain imports from Russia and then Ukraine. And I'll be talking more about that, but let me stop here and hand it over to you. But it's a real crisis.
Okay.
It's a perfect storm. Yeah.
Okay, so you better described it as a perfect storm. And I want to understand the plan of the African Development Bank to raise $1.5 billion emergency food plan. Of course, that was done some few days ago. Please help us understand why this decision was taken and how will this emergency food plan assist African countries to, tackle this perfect storm as you have rightly put it.
Okay, so don't forget that our president, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, used to be the Minister of Agriculture for Nigeria, right, between 2011 and 2015. And although don't forget that when he was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, he launched the most ambitious and the most successful program to raise agricultural production in the Nigerian continent. It was called the Growth Enhancement Support. And don't forget that that program between 2011 and 2015 added 21 million tons of additional food to Nigeria's agriculture. As reflected by inflation in food prices, it was literally flat, like 99% all through any time he was in office, showing that, in fact, there was supply that was keeping the price of food low. So based upon that playbook, we at the African Development Bank feel that what farmers need right now is three things. Number one, availability and affordability of fertilizer and seeds and other inputs for them to produce. Farmers can feed Africa. We have demonstrated it in our programs in Ethiopia and Sudan, that if you give farmers the right technologies and some extension, and also it is a market, they can produce enough food to feed themselves and their countries. So, but farmers have to be given the technology. So affordability and availability. What do I mean by availability? Making sure that the farmers actually can get the fertilizer. We must make sure that supply for fertilizer is strengthened. Supply for seed is strengthened. And also affordability. We must provide them some smart subsidies, support, to be able to ensure that they can purchase those seeds. And this is the same thing that our president did when he was in Nigeria. That is the first thing, availability and affordability of inputs. The second thing is the supply chains for the inputs themselves. We know that, like I said before, there's a gap in fertilizer supply. The price of fertilizer has also gone up seriously. This time last year, urea and diammonium phosphate and many other fertilizer blends were like maybe $400 more or less a ton. Today, they are $1,200. That's a 3 times increase. In Nigeria, go across in our nation, urea, NPK 2010-10 or 15-15-15, used to cost around maybe 8,000 up to 9,000 about a year ago. Today, it is from 17,000 to 25,000, depending on where you are. Even the biggest and most successful importers and wholesalers will have a problem, financing that 3 times, triple times increase in price. So, these importers and wholesalers or blenders, because the case is in Nigeria, they will not be able to, provide finance of supply of fertilizer, and the farmers will not be able to buy it. So we're actually also trying to help to finance the big importers, the big wholesalers, the big aggregators, the big users of fertilizer. That's the second thing. The third thing is what we call policy reforms. Africa should not always be reacting in an emergency from every time there's exogenous shocks to our food supply. We must be able to, strengthen our input distribution, provide credit to our actors in the input value chain, and also provide logistics, for inputs so that we don't have to deal with this every time. So we want policy reforms. We want governments to strengthen fertilizer and seed, input distribution institutions. For example, there's a lot of fake fertilizer being sold in Nigeria. Fake fertilizer. I have tested it myself. I took sample and tested them. Only one had the required nutrients. We need to strengthen the fertilizer, oversight institutions to make sure that they can implement and they can enforce, standards. We also need to strengthen the seeds also that can enforce certified seed production. And then, like I said, we also need to provide access to credit to these players. And finally, we also help with logistics. Getting fertilizer through from the port to the north in Nigeria or other parts of the country is so expensive. It's really difficult. So our plan is to address those 3 things: $1.5 billion, accessible to all African countries. I will believe that in 2 years, we'll produce 37.6 million tons of food by implementing that plan. Yeah, back to you, Nancy.
Okay. Doctor, let's talk about the plans of the African Development Bank in raising that $1.5 billion. I'm curious, how are you all going to raise the money? I know that Dr. Akinwumi Adesina had said something about $1.2 billion or so will be raised from African Development Bank. Then he also met with some people, the U.S. Lawmakers, some days ago too. So speak to me about that. And we just have about less than 5 minutes to the end.
Oh, okay. I'll be fast.
Yes.
So the bank has committed of its own resources $1.3 billion. That's from our windows, our lending windows, the ADB, which is more commercial, lending rates, and then our ADF. ADF simply stands for African Development Fund, which is more concessionary lending. We have committed from our own resources 1.3 billion. We are engaged, as you already rightly said, with several bilateral donors, including the United States, Norway, Canada, the G7, the European Union, on raising an additional $200 million, which mostly go to countries that cannot access the ADB or the ADF windows of the bank. And those countries will receive this money as grants to support them also along the three pillars of the interventions to raise food production, local food production that I talk about. Yeah, back to you, Nancy.
Okay, just another question. Do you think that we've really learnt lessons, especially from COVID-19? I do know that during the pandemic, at least the African Development Bank launched the Feed Africa response to COVID-19. Are there lessons that we've learnt there that perhaps could also help as you utilize this $1.5 billion emergency food facility?
Yes, absolutely. We have learned lessons. Three lessons. Number one lesson, you cannot outsource your food production to outsiders. When there's exogenous shocks, for example, a war in another country that's a major bread basket, or when there's disruption in global supply chains, as we saw under COVID-19, then your people, will have to suffer a shortage in food. So we have learned that you need to strengthen, and Africa can produce its own food. We have 65% of the arable land left in the world for food production. We can produce our own food. That's the first lesson. Don't rely on others for your food. The second lesson is that green channels, during the COVID-19, we have what we call green channels that actually, even though there was disruption in global supply, the government still insisted to keep open the channels for the flow of food and of inputs to farmers. So again, logistics. We have learned that if you really want to win, you have to get logistics. Logistics, not just roads, but also storage. If we had capacity to store even half of the food we produce in Nigeria, we'll not be facing the sharp prices and increase in food. But right now, we have only about 5 to 10% of capacity to store what we produce. Ukraine, we're talking about, has 200% capacity to store food. They produce about 30 million tons of grain every year. They have a storage capacity of 60 million tons. When the war started, they were storing already 60 million tons of food. So again, not just the logistics of road, logistics of storage. And then lastly, we have to get serious about policy reforms. There's a reason why the private sector is not investing in input distribution in agriculture. It's simply because the policies are not right. The playing field is not level. So those three lessons that we have learned: don't outsource your food to others. Food security, sovereignty is food security. Number one, logistics, efficient logistics and policy reforms. You must have them to be able to produce food for yourself and also able to export, to others. Back to you, Nancy.
Okay, Doctor, you're doing very well because all those questions are being imputed into 5 minutes. So we have like a minute more or two just before we go. How will this $1.5 billion be utilized among African countries? Is there a quota? How is the African Development Bank going to share it, so to speak? How is it going to utilize these funds among African countries?
Okay, so like I told you before, there are three categories of financial instruments. The first one is loans through our ADB windows. The second one is loans through our ADF windows, and the third one is grants.
Okay.
So through our ADB windows, usually we have to have lending operations where the country makes a request for a particular sum of money based upon their available headrooms. And then also similar for the ADF, the country makes a request, and then we process that request, and then we disburse the money to the country. There are many financial instruments that we can use to disburse either investment projects or budget support. Depending on what the country's headroom is for those two financial instruments, we can actually use either of them. And then secondly, for the third category, grants. Again, we still need a letter of request from the countries, and then we can provide grants for those countries that are not able to borrow, maybe because of credit risk. They have not been able to pay back their previous loans, and IMF has now put them as on a list of risky countries, but they can still access the grants. And then we also have countries that are under de facto governments, that countries where you have had coups, and then most banks no longer lend to those countries. Again, they can also access the grant component. So those are the financial instruments and the windows that we use this, but it all begins with a letter of request from the different countries. Yeah.
Okay.
Back to you, Nancy.
I want to say many thanks, Doctor, for joining us. I wish we had more time because I really wanted to ask you about the long-term sustainability plan to really win Africa of food imports, and also ask you about the special economic processing zones and all of that. But we will do this again soon. We'll continue to track what's happening, and hopefully we'll get you very, very soon to, to take a look at some of those issues. But thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us today from Abidjan.
Thank you, Nancy, and I wish you good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I've been speaking with Dr. Martin Fregene, who is the Director of Agriculture and Agro-Industry at the African Development Bank in Côte d'Ivoire, that's Abidjan, the capital. We've been talking about the $1.5 billion emergency food facility that has been approved by the African Development Bank to assist African countries, especially as we battle the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So you've heard it from Doctor. The countries, African countries, do need to put in a request. I hope our Nigerian authorities know about this plan and they should do the needful. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for watching. Like I always say, be the best you can be that change that you want to see. You can get across to us on all our social media accounts. I am Nancy Naji. I'll see you all again tomorrow, a fresh edition of the show. Bye for now, but still hook on to this channel. Of course, it's still the APC presidential primaries that all eyes are on, and we'll keep you up to speed on African Independent Television. So I'll see you all again tomorrow. Bye now.